I found in one source that whenever it says about God that he raises up his hand, it's in reference to promising the land of Israel to the people of Israel. And so, in a sense, what we have is the raising of the hand and the pointing or the emphasis on that tangible land of Israel. That's kind of interesting.
Right. Well, I mean, the Ibn Ezra that you're going to read in a second, it's the idea of raising your hand to God. It's a recognition of God's power.
Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube. This week's Torah portion is Vayera. And this week, we had a president raise his hand and recite the oath of office, which is a good excuse to note that there's a lot of hand motions and sign language in Exodus. Aaron lifts up his rod, he extends his hand against the waters of Egypt, and God promises to redeem the Israelites with an outstretched arm. Scholars have noted that the Torah has the richest source of gesture phrases of any ancient Near Eastern religion or literature. The Psalms are full of supplications that include the gesture of raising one's hands, and most importantly, God raises his celestial hand and pledges to bring the Israelites into the land of Israel. So what's the significance of hand gestures in the Torah, and why virtually non-existent in the Jewish ritual and prayer? So join us for Raise Your Hand. So, Rabbi, did you have a chance to watch the inauguration?
I sure did. I'm a patriotic American. I would never miss the inauguration. I love the pomp and ceremony of America.
So I have to admit, I was learning Torah. I was preparing for the podcast. But did he raise his hand? Did he have one hand on the Bible?
And I don't know the story, but I saw that Mrs. Trump was carrying an old Bible. So there must be some story to that Bible that they used.
Fantastic. Well, it is a great segue, and it does make the podcast timely. So as I said, I looked up and I found a really long, I think it was a PhD thesis called Ritual Gestures of Lifting, Extending, and Clasping the Hands in Northwest Semitic Literature and Iconography. And it was published in 2014 by David Michael Calabro. I think he's a Mormon, and I think the way he talks is there's a big department there are almost two schools of gesture, non-verbal gestures in the Bible. And one of them is at this Mormon university. But as I said in the intro, he says the Hebrew Bible has by far the richest source of gesture phrases in Northwest Semitic language. Several of these gesture phrases have more than 10 occurrences, and most phrases either have more than one occurrence or are closely related to another phrase with more than one occurrence, as opposed to the Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Phoenician inscriptions that have a given gesture phrase typically occurs only once or at best a few times. I had never kind of realized that, and I think as we kind of survey, especially Psalms, but all of Tanakh and certainly the Exodus story, there's a lot of gesturing. And Rabbi, we have covered this in a previous podcast, and you know that I have an affinity for motion within prayer. And I was at the Hebrew University, and I was telling them about my kind of interest in this subject, and they gave me this book. And if you can notice on it, it has two hands pointing up, and it's called Nonverbal Language of Jewish Prayer by Uri Ehrlich from Hebrew University. It starts with Kol Atzmotai no To'omarna. We say that every Shabbat. With all my bones will
Jeffrey,
I talk to God.
I have the Hebrew edition of that book.
Oh, I have it. Yeah, I've only in Hebrew.
Oh, it's only in Hebrew. I wasn't looking. Okay, yeah.
I wish it was
yeah,
English.
I have
so
that
I do have a thing, because I have to admit, I do yoga once in a while. When I love this idea of raising your hands. When a whole crowd raises their hands, you might do it during a concert. I just feel that the language of our body actually has a strong impact on our thoughts and our psychology. And I think that for whatever reason, maybe we'll come up with some reasons today, it's been muted in Judaism, in our religion. But today, before we get there, we're going to look at where it appears in our parsha. In this book of called Hasafa Halo Mililiot Shel HaTfilah, the language without words of our prayers, he does say that even though he has two hands on the cover, the chapter on hands is rather short. And he says, and I've translated as best I can, when he talks about hands, he says, nevertheless, when we approach this task of dedicating a chapter to hand gestures in Jewish prayer, we are confronted with an interesting reality. The existing of clasping hands and hand gestures in general, which are a constant in scriptural prayer and good measure even after scripture, disappear completely from the sources of the Mishnaic and Talmudic period. There is nothing in the law, halacha, or anecdotal evidence. There's only one Talmudic source, he claims. If you look in our source sheet, it is in Shabbat 10a, and it's an innocuous reference. Rava, talking about how he would pray, he would remove his cloak and clasp his hands and pray, the kafar yadeha. It goes a little bit further and seems to imply that Rav Kahana said when there is suffering in the world, he would remove his cloak and clasp his hands and pray. And he said that he would be as a slave before his master. However, when there is peace in the world, he would dress and cover himself and wrap himself, no clasping of the hands. So it was literally a language, and I guess it was supplication. I have to say, in the modern world of emojis, and I put the emoji of thank you, religious Jews, non-religious Jews, we all have kind of accepted this. I would venture to guess, Rabbi, that in our youth, we would say that's a Christian symbol.
We sure would. Yeah, the emoji made that universal.
It made it acceptable. So maybe there can be more things that can be acceptable. Now, of course, the only other, I say, exception to halacha regarding prayers would be the duchening, the priestly blessing, which again aren't very many, if any, sources in the Talmud or in the Mishnah, but sure enough in the Shulchan Aruch, when it gets to the rules of the Kohanim blessing the congregation, they have that famous, iconic raising of the two hands in the way that a Kohen does. But again, Rabbi, it is kind of interesting that hand motions are not that significant within ritual, practical Judaism. What's your feeling about that?
It's for sure true. Now, we're talking about the parsha, and of course, I'm sure you'll talk about this. The first hand gesture we have is when Avraham says to his slave, Simna yadcha tachat yirechi, right? It goes all the way back to the beginning of the Torah, where somehow the hand gesture was the ultimate oath and promise that he gave him.
So I think, you're great for mentioning that. And I think the knee-jerk reaction would be when you raise your hand, as the president did today, you are making an oath.
Right.
You bring a pasuk and an incident that I'm not quite referencing. I'm focused on raising the hand, but you're right up there.
Right. I mean, that's a technicality that he happens to put his hand underneath the leg of Avram. So rather than raising his hand, he actually lowered his hand. But the idea is the same. Like you said, it's a motion that's taken as an oath.
Actually, I think we need to stand corrected. The president raised one hand.
And the other hand goes on the Bible.
On the Bible. And I think what you're referencing is the other hand. In other words, you're
that it
putting
went on the bris milah.
You're putting it on something tangible,
right?
And then you raise your hand. So I think it's two sides to the same
That's
coin.
Great. Okay, that's a good Torah.
So in Exodus 6:8, that's our parsha, God says, I will bring you into the land which I swore. That's the translation. The Hebrew is nasiti et yodi, which I raised my hand to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. Rashi says, I have lifted up my hand. I have lifted it up to swear by my throne. So again, I think we already have those two ingredients. On the one hand, you're lifting up the hand, and it's an oath. And the second, it's like the kisei hakavod, al kaisia. God is allegorically, kiviachol, putting his other hand on something tangible. Here's something interesting, Rabbi. In Numbers 14:30, it says, if any of you should enter the land over which I lifted my hand in an oath to have you dwell in it, except for Caleb, son of Yefuneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. This is after the sin of the messengers. But I found in one source that whenever it says about God that he raises up his hand, it's in reference to promising the land of Israel to the people of Israel. And so in a sense, what we have is the raising of the hand and the pointing or the emphasis on that tangible land of Israel. That's kind of interesting.
Right. Well, I mean, the Ibn Ezra that you're going to read in a second, it's the idea of raising your hand to God. It's a recognition of God's power. I don't know if that's exactly why the president raises his hand.
We don't know, first of all, what was in the mind of this president for sure. But I think if you Google and you look at Wikipedia, there are some references to the Bible. There's a whole lot of references to Roman, to Greek, to other ancient sources. I would kind of argue, and let's talk about the Ibn Ezra for a second. The Ibn Ezra says the obvious, that this is figurative. This is derech mashal. No one believes that God has a literal hand, but I think the other way of saying this is, since lo dibra Torah ela b'lashon b'nei Adam, that God uses allegories, metaphors, analogs of what humans do. Again, it's still important because what it's saying is that whatever God is doing in these verses, this is what man does. So if at this point all of the commentaries are kind of focused on it being an oath, so God raises his allegorical hand, but what it's saying is that universally, and that would confirm that Romans do it and Greeks do it, and the whole world has some sort of sense of you're raising your hand, you're in a sense buying in, or maybe you're making a commitment.
Let me just ask you, is that the idea of one hand on the Bible and raising the other hand, does every country have that today? When you become the Prime Minister of England, do you raise your hand and put a hand on the Bible? Or is that an American thing?
I don't know. I do believe that when I looked at the Wikipedia sources, it went back at least to medieval times.
Oh, so the answer is yes, everybody has it.
Yeah, but I think what it was putting one's hand on a sword, putting one's hand on something temporal, something tactile. But again, that seems to be the universal part of it. As I said, Exodus, the book that we're reading now, is almost a study in hand motions. We're focused on this particular one, but there's no question. The hand motions were a language in and of itself.
Last week, Moshe, his hand, it becomes leprous. Right? And the stick becomes a snake. There's a lot of that stuff there. The hocus pocus is about hand motions.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Abraham having his servant swear to him, but in his interaction with the king of Sodom, and there were the fights between the kings, Abraham said to the king of Sodom in Genesis 14:22, I swear is the translation, but what it really says is, Heramti yadi el Hashem, I lift up my hand to God, Most High, creator of heaven and earth. So here too, it's pre-Sinai, and the king of Sodom understood what he was doing. It's pretty universal. What's interesting is how Ramban understands it. And Ramban brings Rashi, he brings all of the other commentaries, and then he says something fascinating. He says, but Onkelos said, I have lifted my hand in prayer before the eternal. The intent of Abraham's words coming according to Onkelos is, I have prayed to God with my hands spread forth toward heaven. That is kind of fascinating. And of course, that's right in line with the direction that I was looking to go, which is, if this is truly a modality of expression, why don't we express ourselves with it more? He goes on to say that Abraham was declaring things to be sacred to him is called in Hebrew lifting of a hand. he uses, Rabbi, the language of sacrifices, of when for instance, the farmer brings the tenufa, the first crop, he raises it up. That's what he sees you doing when you raise your hand. Not so much swearing, but transferring from you to God or from God to the people of Israel.
You could say that raising your hand in sacrifice is a form of prayer.
Well, absolutely. Since prayer took over the place of
Right.
sacrifice, there's a total segue from one into the other. But according to this study that I quoted before, there is one scholar named Strine who literally says that the nasu yadenu, the raising up of the hand, is actually the transfer of property. And of course, what did I think of immediately, Rabbi? I thought of Kinyan Chalipin. Those of you
Selling the
who have
chametz.
Well, the chametz or at a wedding.
Yeah, at a wedding,
Those
correct.
of you who have been at an Orthodox wedding, you go to the chassan tish, you see something very strange. The rabbi will take a pen, he'll take a handkerchief, he'll take something that has material presence, he'll have the groom hold it high and transfer it to him, giving him the ability to marry them. Or in the case that you're talking about, Rabbi, of selling the chametz, being able to be your agent to sell the chametz. But again, I think that's a very pictorial analog to what we're talking about. You raise your hand, you're transferring something.
Right. That's very, very interesting. Right. And it's symbolic because the whatever you're raising, the pen, the handkerchief, whatever you're raising is not the value of what it represents, either at the chassan tish or for selling your chametz. Your chametz is worth a lot more than the handkerchief, but that's a symbolic raising.
Yes, absolutely. And so from that perspective, we're mimicking what God did here, this transference. In Psalms 141:2, it says, "Take my prayer as an offering of incense, my upraised hands as an evening sacrifice." So it literally combines this raising up of the hand and giving a sacrifice. I think, Rabbi, I'm a big believer in the ability of our ritual to preserve the depth of our tradition. When we wash our hands before eating bread, we go al natilat yadayim. Correct me if I'm wrong. The custom is to raise one's
That's correct.
hands.
Some people say beforehand, "Su yadechem kodesh," raise your hands. That's the same idea.
So I don't know whether I'm contradicting myself and that we do actually have hand motions, we just don't recognize them, or not. But let's go with it because
Okay.
it's true. We do say that. And when we do, so that's al natilat yadayim, taking the hands. When we take a lulav and an etrog, we use the same word, al natilat lulav. And there too, the motion is raising it up. So I do think we have this vocabulary, non-verbal vocabulary in our tradition, but maybe we overlook
I
it.
want to say that when it comes to Netilat Yadayim and Netilat Lulav, the raising might be a show of its importance.
But that too could be part of the language of raising one's hand.
Right. No, that's correct. But I'm just saying it's a little different. It's not quite prayer. It's just, hey, here's the lulav. I want to pick it up. This is the important thing of the day.
So this gentleman who did this 160-page study on the nonverbal language of hands, he actually gives us a bunch of stuff. He says you're exposing your hand. You are surrendering. We've seen that already in the Gemara in Shabbat. When things are bad, you surrender as a slave. There's exposing of the hands. Then there is attracting attention, like waving your hand. But again, I think that means the important part of it. You're saying something is important. The desire to interact with the other, that displays the relationship between parties, suggesting subservience on the part of the one performing the gesture, a gesture of approach. So really, I think the more we think about it, what of that vocabulary that we do have actually is very profound. It connotes so many different things. And I think that becomes fascinating. In Psalm 63, it says, I bless you all my life. I lift up my hands invoking your name. But in Barachot, and this is kind of interesting, Rabbi Eliezer says, what is the meaning of that which is written? So I will bless you as I live. To your name I will raise my hands, quoting the Psalm verse that I just did. He says, so I will bless you as I live refers to the recitation of the Shema, and to your name I will raise my hands refers to the Amidah prayer. So, in fact, there is another reference to raising hands in the Talmud, and it actually associates raising one's hands
With prayer.
with prayer, the penultimate prayer of the Amidah.
Right. So actually, that's explicit. Right? We talked about all these things that are suggestive. That thing from the Gemara is actually explicit, that raising your hands is a form of prayer. Right? I mean, people who go like this, right? It's also gratitude, right? When the quarterback scores a touchdown, he goes like this. I know, because that's what touchdown is. But it's also gratitude, right? You raise your hands to God is gratitude.
But again, getting back to that prayer emoji that in our youth we would have considered very Christian, I would suggest that if when you're giving your drasha this Shabbat, you said something particularly empowering and everybody went up in their hands and they went like this, you would be taken a little bit aback. You'd say, am I
We don't do that kind of stuff.
We don't, but maybe we did and maybe we should. But anyway, here's this interesting one. I said a second ago that when you raise your hand, you're exposing it. In Isaiah 1:15, it says, and when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Through you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. So what he's saying is, you can raise your hands all you want. If there's damn blood on your hands, as Shakespeare would say, out, damn spot, you're not going to go anywhere. So true. I think it really shows that what you're also saying when you raise your hands is you have nothing to hide. You're not armed, but you also have no stain on you. As I said before, the Psalms are full of this stuff. In Psalms 28, it says, listen to my plea for mercy when I cry out to you, when I lift my hands towards your inner sanctuary. I would think, Rabbi, that most of us students of rabbinic literature are more aware of Esa Einai, raising up our eyes, than raising up our hands. I'm just making a guess. Am I wrong here?
No, for sure. And I mean, but that's also a form of prayer. Esa Einai Harim Be'ayin Yavo Ezri. Where will my help come from? That's raising your eyes as a form of prayer. Raising is a form of prayer. Maybe they're related, Netilat Lulav, because maybe the reason raising is a form of prayer is because that's a form of showing it's important, and you're important by referencing God somehow.
It's a whole language. It's a whole beautiful language. And I stand, as much as we find in these texts, I stand by my original suggestion that we de-emphasize it, and there's a lot of richness there that we can rediscover and that can empower us and enrich us. You know, in Chronicles 2:6-13, it says, he stood with them kneeling in front of the whole congregation of Israel. He spread forth his hands to heaven. This is about Solomon. We see it once a year in Yom Kippur, where we prostrate ourselves during the Olenu. I will argue that kneeling, bending the knees, raising the hand was a whole language that enables us not only to understand the text that we read today about God making the oath, but also many things in our tradition.
So let's talk about that for a second. Actually, bowing down is the opposite of raising hands, right? Because raising hands is up and bowing down is down. You would almost say that bowing down is the other kind of prayer, which is a sign of humility. We bow before you. Raising hands is a sign of kind of, we're there to raise our hands to God.
So I just love this discussion because what we're doing is we're just diving into the language, this nonverbal language. And what I would say to you is when we start the Amidah, we go Baruch Atah, and then Adonai, we raise up. There's the bending of the legs, and then there's God raises us up. That's the explanation.
In the introduction to the Art Scroll Sitter, Rabbi Saul Berman, whom we know very well, the successor of Rabbi Riskin in Lincoln Square Synagogue, he wrote the introduction. You know, there's a tradition that at the beginning of the Shmona Esrei, we take 3 steps forward. At the end of the Amidah, we take 3 steps backwards. He wrote the entire introduction about those 3 steps forward and the 3 steps backward. How that's important. We approach God and then we walk away from God. So there, again, it's with our feet. You're talking about with our hands, and then we talk about bowing down with our knees, and then we approach God with our feet and we walk away from God. We say, by the way, at the end of Kaddish, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, we walk away. Isn't that so interesting? We walk away. You want to go further? In Boi B'Shalom and Lachadodi, we also turn around, right? We turn around towards the door. We bow towards the door. That's so weird, but that's very important. It's nonverbal. We would say nonverbal communication, really.
I mean, when you finish the Oseh Shalom, you go Oseh Shalom, you go to one side, you go to the other side, and then you go forward. During Kiddush Levana, we really extenuate that.
Right, that's
and
correct.
We go Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. And, you know, in Islam, the most holy thing that's done 5 times a day, they literally say Salam Aleichem, and they go to each side. There is this rich tradition that we have not scrubbed completely. And I dare to say the discussion that we're having, the discussion, the intro that Berman gave, you could have a whole class on tefillah and try to rediscover and re-emphasize the nonverbal language, the physical language, and see where it takes you. I think it's absolutely wonderful. So besides the book that I quoted at the beginning, I found an article. It was actually in, I think, the Jerusalem Post. It's called World of the Sages, Hand Motions During Prayer.
Oh, wow.
by Levi Cooper. And in it, the first thing that he does is he talks about the Hasidim, to a large degree, reintroduced bodily motion. He says that Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, who I think was he the predecessor of Chabad?
He's the first Chabad Rebbe.
He was the first Chabad Rabbi. He used to bang his hands on the wall so fervently during prayers that they had to pad the walls. Now, I was very influenced by Rav Shmuel Dishon, who is a Stoliner Karliner Hasid. And in their early Hasidim, they were accused of doing flips during davening. But even till today, you go in there, never in the history of the Karliners has the rabbi ever said, be quiet, we're trying to pray here. When you go in there, you can't hear yourself think, it's so loud. They are screaming, they hold their hands to their ears so they can hear themselves even better. It's a whole different form of prayer that I think many of us would find strange.
But it's verbal.
That's verbal. There's no question. The flips, not so much. The hitting the wall, not so much. And of course, the detractors of the Hasidim came out very, very much against this. And he talks about Maimonides' son, who wanted to return to original prayer styles where there was much more gesturing and movement along those lines. And then this is the closest I've seen that come to suggesting maybe why this kind of disappeared. Some halachists suggest that prayer with outstretched arms in the manner of Gentile prayer and therefore should be avoided. This was a teshuvah from Beersheba of all places, Poland, Italy, and others. Modern scholars have demonstrated that a serious issue is at stake here. Christians saw Moses' outstretched arms as a prefiguration of crucifixion. This explains the reticence of Jewish artists to portray this biblical incident, while their Christian counterparts display no such hesitation. Then he goes on to say, thus we see that cultural environs have impacted our prayer norms. Even the suggestion of Rabbi Abraham, Maimonides' son, calling for outstretched arms while making requests of God may have been influenced by his milieu. There is no precedent in Jewish sources for distinguishingly singling out requests when it comes to hand gestures. In all likelihood, such a distinction has its roots in Muslim ritual.
That's so interesting.
I think that there is no question that either as a form of doing not what the other does, or letting the other take certain of our rituals and therefore they became no longer comfortable for us to do it, or maybe just not being open and exposed to how different religions and cultures express themselves spiritually. For whatever reason, I think the consensus is that there has been a pullback from physical gestures specifically in reference to prayer. And I think that opens up all sorts of possibilities.
I think that's great. This is a great topic. And it's good to find, this is a hard parsha. It's great to find this topic in this parsha.
I agree. And getting back to the president, I hope that he gives an oath, but I hope that he also opens up his hand in purity and joins us and moves with us and leads us. It's a profound message for ourselves, but it's also a profound message for our leaders. And so, let's just hope and pray with our hands just a little more.
We'll say amen. Everyone says amen. Have a great trip. Shabbat shalom, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Shabbat shalom. Great talking with you.